Hey everyone, this episode is brought to you by our friends at Alta, who build grain storage and handling equipment. You can find out more about them on their website at www.nearalta.com. That's www.neeralta.com. A big thanks to them for sponsoring the show and making this conversation possible. Hey everybody, welcome back to Real Talk. Today I'm joined by James Teitsma. It's a pleasure to have you. Thanks for joining me.
Thank you. It's my pleasure as well.
You bet. It's good to chat with you finally. I think we've had this set up for a little while, so good to finally talk to James. If you don't want to introduce yourself, a little bit what you've done, I guess, and your family and things, and we'll jump into some of your work.
Sure. So like you said, I'm James Teitsma. I think the reason I'm here is because I'm a retired MLA and cabinet minister in the government of Manitoba. And I served there for 7 years and 7 months as an MLA, and for the last year or so as a cabinet minister. Married to my lovely wife Joanne for many years. We'll put it at about 27 thereabouts, 27 and a half, something like that. And together we've got 6 kids ranging in age from 8 to 26, 3 girls and 3 boys.
Wow. Yeah, we won't ask how many years it is. That's a dangerous road to go down.
I think I got it right. I think I did.
Oh, there you go.
Yeah.
So yeah, you we were mostly interested in chatting. I mean, you've done a lot of different things in your life. Very interesting I guess career path, but also been involved in public office, in business. I hear you're actually a musician and organist too.
Yeah, I do all that.
You cringed at that. I heard it's not overly cringy. That's good. And yeah, like lots of different interests. But to start, why don't you kind of bring us along your road of education and then how you got into business? We just did actually just recently, when we're recording this is probably the last one that came out, an episode on vocation, about what is your calling. Is that something that you knew all along, or how did that kind of develop in your life?
No, it was, I'm more just walk through the doors that God opens for me, and work hard and diligently in whatever office and calling I have. But I would say like my career path is mostly marked by God graciously turning my failure into some success, and so that was the case kind of all along. I'm probably one of the few computer programmers, computer scientists to ever get into politics. I didn't meet too many others. There's some engineers and teachers and things like that in politics, and lawyers, but not too many computer programmers. So I don't want to speculate on why that might be, but I was always a bit of an odd duck, even in computer programming, because I was very extroverted, and most of my classmates were less so, and so I naturally ended up in roles that were more managerial, more client facing. I would talk to our customers a lot, and so that was good. But yeah, I was kind of alluding that my failures is what led to God making me successful. I remember one distinct one. I really managed to tick off a professor at university, so much so that he said if I would take a course with him, he would give me an F out of spite. And so he was just substituting at the time, so I avoided him like the plague. I didn't go anywhere near him. And then after I graduated, I ended up getting assigned to this 2-week training seminar, and he was the instructor. And so I'm like, hi. Boy. And he's like, oh, remember me? And I'm like, yes, I do remember you. But anyway, so I apologized for my past irreverent behavior that I had back in first year university, and I helped him teach the class. And the next thing I know, a few days later, another professor of mine phoned me up and said, well, I was just talking to that guy, and he strongly recommended I hire you. And that turned out to be the best job I could ever imagine having. So we wrote, it was financial planning software, and we ended up becoming the #1 provider of financial planning software in the world, completely dominating the Canadian market. Yeah, it's pretty good. And so that, and I joined the company when there was only I guess 7 people. I was the 7th person in the door. And
Wow.
then when we sold it, we had 320 staff roughly. So it grew, yeah, exponentially. And I was the only executive level member because I ended up getting to chief development officer or CTO type role. I was the only executive member to kind of stick around after the sale. Most of the other ones retired and or moved on in various ways. And so, but even as I kind of stuck around, it was clear that the company that had acquired us didn't really want Winnipeg to be the headquarters anymore. So
Mm.
that's what kind of opened up the opportunity for me to consider going into politics.
Oh, really? Wow. So that's did you have kind of inclinations you would like to get into public office, or did you have interest in uh you
Yeah,
work in that?
and it was so awkward. Like, so I kind of spared you the sidebar. Like while I was doing financial planning software professionally, then I was busy with all kinds of other stuff. I conduct our local church choir. I play organ and piano, and I write music. And but on top of that, I've been asked at an early age to join the Reform Perspective board of directors.
Right.
And I served on there for a number of years. And then that board essentially gave birth to ARPA Canada.
Right.
And so I was asked to continue to serve on the board of ARPA Canada. And so that's really what kind of stirred the interest. The ARPA folks were talking a lot about how to develop relationships with politicians, but also how to encourage people to get into politics. So I guess I took their advice and resigned from the board and stepped into public life. But even then, it was quite a surprise. I've grown up in this neighborhood in my constituency, the one I represented. It's called Radisson. It's essentially like the west part of Transcona for people who might know Winnipeg. And I lived in this area for nearly my whole life. And then 6 months before I decided to run, I ended up buying a house outside of the area in East St. Paul. It was a bigger home on an acreage and lots of room for the 6 kids. And then and yeah, that I didn't keep that house very long. So ended up building a house back and trying to get back to my roots, back to where I'd grown up and represent this area. So yeah, it was rather unexpected, I'd say. I didn't see it coming. But it was a lot of things lined up. So the ARPA Canada talks and those folks were encouraging me to go. Quite a few people from my church said, what are you going to do next? Because they sort of saw that selling the business was kind of sunsetting my career there.
Mm.
And they're like, would you think about this? Would you consider that? But when I was young, I always said, when I get to about 40, early 40s, which is when this all transpired, I was going to become a teacher. That's what I had determined to do. I was going to teach computer science and music, and I had this great plan laid out. And no, didn't happen. So maybe it'll happen.
Was that like after I make my millions plan, and then you that's I think
I
that's
never
all a lot of kids.
I never intended to do that, at least not at first, to have that kind of success. I just thought I was going to be a normal hardworking guy. And yeah, I was not particularly ambitious in that way, just more diligent and God blessed it. Yeah, in ways that I don't think I could have ever asked or imagined. So
yeah. Did the politics, like, did people encouraging you help you get into it, or was it something that
yeah,
you were kind of like you were toying with as you were winding up?
honestly, I was more dreading it, I think. And part of me, this is the fatalism, right? So like, okay, a lot of people are asking me to get into politics, and ARPA is suggesting that running for office is a good thing. And I'm like, well, why don't I just take a shot and just see how it goes? And at that moment, I was living in a Tory stronghold that had voted conservative forever. But there was also an MLA there that was not going to be easy to defeat in a nomination race, if I could even encourage one. Whereas my home turf, like where we moved back to and where I'd grown up, that had been represented by the NDP since inception. So
Wow.
I think there was one exception in there in the history of over a period of about 50 years, somewhere back in the 70s. Somebody else represented it. different boundaries back then too, so who knows?
Right.
But and federally, we were also represented almost unceasingly by the NDP. But we did have Lawrence Tote, who's a member of Redeemer. He was for one term the MP for a much bigger area that includes my constituency. And so there was a little bit of hope in the window that maybe this could happen. But I honestly, I kind of entered it going, I'm okay losing.
Right.
I was perfectly fine with just experiencing the run and having a go at it. But if with everything, I work diligently and I go at it pretty hard. And so I didn't plan to lose certainly,
Right.
but I was perfectly fine with it, whatever outcome.
Right.
So yeah, so
Was there an
that's it.
environment there, like in that riding, was the conservative member willing to step aside for you, or was it
So
something that there wasn't even one there? Or?
no, like in the riding I ran in, there's only been conservative getting defeated over those years, many decades. And a couple came, closer than others. But so when I got there, I sort of asked, hey, what's the riding association look like? And can I join it? And they're like, you can be it because there isn't one. And they're like, according to our records, there's $158 in a pillow somewhere, but it doesn't seem to be in a bank account. And so if you could put together a board, that would be great. So I got the blessing of the party to assemble a board, and I basically just constituted a meeting with a few dozen invitations to the members of the party that lived in this area, and then I signed up a few dozen more, mostly from the church community, honestly, to serve, and picked out myself a constituency president and secretary and treasurer and all that other good stuff, and we became the association, and so yeah, it was right from the get-go. I didn't have to invade because it was there was really nothing there.
Right. So from like, I want to encourage people to get into politics, obviously, a little bit. Like it's one of those things where you can have more of an impact than you maybe think you can. We've touched on that before on this podcast, but from like recommending to other people in different areas, like, would you recommend looking at the area that you live in? And if the environment isn't maybe favorable to make a move like this and actually do something, would you recommend people looking for something, some kind of signs in other ridings that they know might have this opportunity?
Yeah, I think like so for me, I'm a swing as well. I shouldn't say that. I was not a swing seat. I turned this seat effectively, or God turned this seat into a swing seat on my behalf. So it was not necessarily, I don't know if I can necessarily give like strong advice there. I would say that the more certain your election would be as a candidate, the harder it will be to become the candidate.
Right.
Okay. So if you want to be a sure thing and you want to make sure that you're going to get elected, that is going to be a tough road. Let's say you think of like a guy like Sam Osterhoff or something like that. Like now that he has been elected and now he's even in associate minister in cabinet, I've every confidence that he'll be able to continue for as long as he has the favor of his premier, and whether even if that government should fall, he'll likely still be the member, and because he's in kind of a sure thing seat. But for him to get over that first hump was a huge hurdle. He had to beat a towering presence in the Ontario PC party, and it was quite a surprise to have him do that. So that path totally works, but it's going to be a hard sell up front. Whereas in mine, it was pretty trivial to become the candidate, because there just wasn't that many people willing to run. And I wouldn't say that, I wouldn't necessarily tell people, you should just go run in some riding where for sure you're going to lose. And then there's people we need to do that, and there's actually, you get a voice when you do that. So there's something to be said for that, but you're not going to get elected, humanly speaking. And so yeah, something that swings or something that looks like it might swing would be a good target, easier to get in. But yeah, and then the closer you get to power, the more political things can get, and kind of, frankly, not kind of unpleasant.
Yeah,
it's not not the way I like to run things, but
Mhm.
you do run into those kind of things when you start having more and more of an influence.
Yeah, and I'm sure. Yeah, I think we've seen that in several spots, not just with Christian MPs and MLAs, but even just with generally conservative people. Um, is it an easier? Can you describe that road a little bit? I mean, I guess obviously the nomination part was easy. In your instance, I know Sam worked really hard at his in Ontario. Um, and then his was kind of a sure thing in the general election, whereas yours was probably a lot tougher. Is it if you were to put them up against each other, which is harder to do if there's um a long-standing conservative member?
Yeah, I would say both are good. Like both work. I haven't talked to Sam in a bit, so I don't, for him to want to be the MLA or MPP, I guess they call it in Ontario. Um, some of my colleagues here like have served for 30 years or 40 years as an MLA, and he's young enough that he could do that.
Mhm.
I'm not sure he'll have the legs to want to do that, and that's up to him. For me, knowing that it was going to be 8 to 12 seemed pretty likely. Like, we probably could win one more election, and then the one after that would be dicey, and the one after that would be almost for sure not.
Right.
Humanly speaking, again, right? So that actually provided me some comfort and confidence that I wasn't going to be committed to politics for the rest of my life. Because while I was in it is quite a lot that's not particularly pleasant. So here you're trying to encourage people to run, and I'm telling you that it's not necessary. Well, it's not necessarily for everybody, because I think
Mhm.
you sort of have to have this expectation that there are parts of the job that are going to be unpleasant, and that are going to kind of weigh on you, and so you need to be prepared, I guess, to be able to handle that and have the right attitude towards that.
Right.
I think I did. But at the same time, when I lost re-election, it's kind of a relief too. And it did not take me long at all to say, thank you, God, for the time that I could be an MLA, and thank you for the rest that I can have now that I'm not an MLA, right?
Mm.
Again, I ran hard. I did try to win, and I actually thought I had a good shot of winning. But yeah, just these things happen.
How
So.
did you calculate that you the timeline that you might have in there? Like what goes into that?
Oh, yeah, I mean, that might be local to Manitoba. I'm not as familiar with every other province, but generally speaking, when we switch governments, we typically give them a second term. And then if they do a good job, we give them three.
Hmm.
And then if the opposition is particularly inept, which is what led to our victory in 2016, they end up with four. So the NDP were in government for 17 years, which is a really, really long time. And arguably, we should have been able to win the election before that and kept them down to 12 or 13. But so that seesaw has been pretty regular ever since
Right.
like the 1960s, I think, in Manitoba politics, that it just sort of
Right.
rocks back and forth every 8 to 12.
Yeah, it
Yeah.
seems I think it's similar in Ontario was they had a long liberal government which then dissolved into them not having a liberal party even. So that was a
Indeed.
interesting provincial
Yeah.
move there. Um
Yeah. You don't quite know. And yeah, you're again, you're speculating, right? And so I didn't know. Like I did have to have the in my mind, I had to have the possibility that I might have to choose to leave politics, that it wouldn't
hmm,
automatically leave me. And so, I kind of thought through that too. I'm still relatively young, I guess. I'm in my early 50s, but I could see I had colleagues that were in their 70s and in their late 60s, and I thought, I don't think I can do it that long. So
yeah, so as a church or as Christians, we like to encourage younger people to study or to get into politics. I know Sam's a really, I mean, he's the example that comes up all the time. He kind of just went right from school and right into the legislature, which is, I mean, it's never been done, so it's pretty impressive. But
yeah.
yeah, can you speak to like, I mean, getting in is one thing, but also getting out. How did like where you were with your profession and your career, um, your family, your stability, like how did that play into your willingness and ability to run a campaign and then to be an MLA? And then also when you got
Yeah.
out, like were you fearful at all that you would run another 10 years or have to decide like, I need to get out before I retire, or like
No, no, no.
you
I'm
need
never afraid. I'm never
yeah.
afraid of
Do
it.
you need some
But I like
energy
what
when you get back out? Like,
that varies by individual. So for me, it was very seamless exit. Um, but I'll just talk about on the way in first. Like, so on the way in, a lot of times you're going to have a lot of aspirations and misunderstandings, quite frankly, of how the system works. And so my advice, like once you're elected, is take time to learn the ropes. You do not, like, when on week number one as a green MLA or new representative, you do not know the ropes. So find good mentors, and you should have found them already before you got elected. But find good mentors and really observe what's going on and how things are accomplished, and try your best to understand that, because I think when and most people looking from the outside think, well, MLAs, they make laws, right? And right away when I got in, then I found out, well, that doesn't happen actually that often, without the endorsement of the party, certainly. And even when you make a suggestion for a law, right, you kind of need your caucus to say, yeah, I like that, right? And
mhm,
so you can't just go rogue, right? You are part of a team. You have your own team backing you as you're getting elected, and then you have a bigger team that you kind of have to interact with when you're elected. So yeah, it was all of that, I think, worked together for me, and then I ended up on Treasury Board pretty quickly. I was one of the more green entries, I guess, in that I didn't have a lot of legislative experience when they threw me on there, and I ended up serving longer than any of my other colleagues um, during our 7 years and 7 months of government on the Treasury Board, and I was the vice chair at the end when I was a minister. So
wow.
yeah, but it was good in terms of the entry. Yeah, for me, my career was sort of at a turning point too. So
Mhm.
I knew I had to do something different, or likely would have to do something different. I could have just got a regular job, I suppose. I could have arguably taken some time. I could have got a B.Ed and become a band teacher or something. I don't know. There's all kinds of things I could have done, and so politics seemed like the first door to open. And so if I had lost that election, I think then I probably, yeah, maybe I would have switched into teaching or something else. But I didn't. I won, and then I had to carry on from there.
Hmm. Is it I guess provincial politics might be different than federal, but is it easy to carry on business if you were running a business and wanted to do that? Or is it pretty much a full-time, like you can't really have anything else going on kind of gig?
Uh, yeah, answers on that will vary too. I would recommend that you view it as a full-time job. But in a way, it's good if there's a bit of a lid on that to it. So when I was first into it, I was into it hard. I was doing 60, 70-hour weeks. I was away a lot of evenings. I tried to say yes to almost every invitation I got, and then I, found out that I was getting about 10 invitations a week, and to get to events. And of course, that's just not sustainable.
Hmm.
So I started kind of peeling back and prioritizing and saying, which kind of events I would be interested in. Anything local to my constituency would get prioritized. Some particular causes that were near and dear to me would get prioritized, but a lot of the other ones I just have to send regrets. And then sometimes you're also asked to substitute for a minister when you're a backbencher. Minister can't make it. They'll be like, hey, can anybody do this? Can anybody do that? And I would usually prioritize those as well. And so then that kind of eased up the workload. But I found that some of my colleagues, because they were incredibly ambitious, right? And they would do everything, including, am I allowed to say kissing butt on your podcast? I just did. So they spent a lot of time doing that sort of thing, and that's not me. I'm not going to do that. And so schmoozing might have been a more polite way to say that, but anyways, they would do that kind of stuff all the time, and it would consume them, especially if it didn't produce a good result. And
Mm.
so for me, having something else to kind of use my creative talents in and stuff like that was good. So I stayed involved with choir, for example. And then a few years after I was in politics, when it was one of the lower spots, actually, in a way, then I ended up with six other people. So it was a total of seven partners. They wanted to start a business that kind of continued on the work that we had done before. And I told them no 3 times before I finally told them yes. And there's a whole story there too. But the deal was that politics was my priority, and that if I had to do politics, I would not do anything for the company. And but if I had time, 15 hours here, 20 hours there on a, over the summer was generally better. That kept me busy, and it kept me, I think, sane, a little more sane than some of my colleagues who really just put everything into politics. And then, yeah, they really felt like their life had been kind of taken
Mm.
away from them when they lost, and their future had been taken away. And I didn't have any of those feelings at all. So
Yeah, it's cool to hear you say that because I'm curious about that, how it consumes you, because obviously like if you really love the constituency you work in, and like the people you work for, and you really are trying to, especially as a Christian, to push as hard as you can to actually have an impact. um I can see how when you lose, even though you're, probably half expecting it, you're like, all of a sudden you have no job. You're just kind of like, I was this, I was this guy, I had these opportunities, and now everything's just gone, right?
yeah, and I've seen some of my non-Christian colleagues really get blown out of the water when they lost. Um, for for I think anybody who has a good sense of the providence of God shouldn't get completely blown out of the water, right? It should be your election loss was decided in advance by God. Don't worry about it. He knows that it's for your good, and so you just have to trust in Him and take it from there. But for me, I could just see it because the president of that company that I referred to, he waited 24 hours, I think, and then he called me and he's like, congratulations on your loss. When would you like to start full time? How many
Yeah.
weeks off do you need? Was kind of the question. And so that, I mean, that made it pretty easy
Yeah, fair.
um, for me, pretty seamless transition. But it's disruptive, and if I think about, like, if you're someone who's living paycheck to paycheck, for example, it's pretty hard to make the jump into politics because there's a lot of disruptions
Right.
along the way, right? You'll take time off and not get paid for months as you're campaigning and things like that. Um, it can be pretty bumpy from a cash flow
Hmm.
perspective. So it's, in a way, there's things that people can do to like, so I could, for example, say to somebody, look, I'll make sure that you're okay as long as you run and get elected. And I think there could be people who do that as part of their encouraging role, is to make sure that those cash flow bumps are not too hard to ride out. Or it's just people who have had some success and are still relatively young, and I think that was me, that I could afford to take a year off work if I needed to.
Yeah, would there be an opportunity there in our communities to do a bit of that, like fundraising for these opportunities? Because there probably are, when you identify these opportunities in a riding, something that could move, say, even a conservative stronghold, someone's retiring or something. Like, is that something that we should be considering doing, and putting forward a candidate, and helping them out just financially as a
Yeah,
community?
I would say so. One of my colleagues in the Manitoba legislature, I think he was a trucker beforehand, but he was sort of hand selected by, this is not a Reformed group of Christians, but it was a homeschool focused group of Mennonites and the like. And they sort of handpicked him and said, we want you to be the next MLA when this current MLA retires or is booted out or whatever ended up happening to him. And so they tagged him, I think, 4 years beforehand, so he knew at any moment it could happen. And then they made sure that he was able to run financially, and then he ran. And so, yeah, I think there's a absolutely an opportunity to mentor and to enable someone to be able to run.
Yeah, I think that would be really cool, just to be able to, because there's obviously talent, people, but people are, if they're not financially in that spot, or, um, yeah, if they don't feel like they could do it of themselves, like, it'd be nice to come alongside people to have that impact.
For
But
sure.
so one of the bigger questions I guess our listeners probably have, especially when we talk to politicians, MLAs, like, as a Christian, how did you find being able to be a Christian in politics? Like, I think people a lot of times focus on, um, kind of, yeah, the fact that it's probably tough. Like, you get in spots where it's not always black and white, and also, um, having to maybe compromise a little bit on your faith to get something done. How did you find balance? Like, how do you,
Yeah,
were you
I
able
don't,
to
I don't
pretty
think I
much,
would use. I don't think I'd use the phrase "compromise on my faith," but I would say that you have to recognize how it works, right? So, and for me, everything to measure the effectiveness of what you're doing, you should look at the outcome. Because if there's if you're just a noisy gong and a clanging cymbal and nothing happens, no change happens, or even worse, the opposite of what you wanted to have happen happens. It's not effective, right? And so look at the outcomes that you're trying to achieve and keep those in focus. But while you're doing that, it's not that the ends justify the means either, right? So there's only certain means that I'm willing to take. So stabbing my colleague in the back is not one of the means I'm willing to take. Lying openly to the public or to people who are in government is not one of the means I'm willing to take. And so I have a limited set of means that I'm willing to take. And then there's the outcomes that I want to have. But sometimes those means would be, remaining silent, for example, and saying, now's not the time to say something, because if I do, it'll actually be worse, not better, right? Or picking your audience, right? So sometimes I think, this can happen in any environment, but you can say, well, now that we've got this group of 35 people, I'm going to look good and I'm going to say something really profound and wise, and that'll kind of probably embarrass our leader, and or maybe he'll think more highly of me or something like that. But they're trying to kind of promote themselves, when in reality, what you really want is for the leader to take that idea and to make it their own, and get it done. And so if you're not interested in taking credit, and you're just good at giving it, like I did that with my leader Brian Pallister, I would just whisper to him in the hallway, kind of in the way to, on the way from a caucus meeting to the ledge, in such a way that he would almost think it was his idea to do something or to say something in a certain way, and then he would do it, and I go, "Oh,
got done.
Mission accomplished. I'm not taking any credit for it, right? Nobody needs to know that I accomplished that or whatever." And he's feeling pretty good about himself. It's fine. And so because you're out after the outcome, when you stay focused on that and don't worry about your own position in government or your own promotion, like a lot of people were, for me, for example, they could see my talents and my abilities and business background and things, and they're like, you should be in cabinet. And the reason you're not is because you're an uncompromising Christian. And that's why you're stuck on Treasury Board, where nobody can see you. All your brains get to be, I could use my brains there, and I could do good work in Treasury Board, but there's no public facing role, right?
Right.
A lot of people don't even realize what that body does and how it does it. And so government was probably more comfortable with me there, because I think when you're a Christian in politics, you have to recognize that some people will fear you because of that. They'll fear what you're going to say or what you're going to do, or they'll even just get annoyed that they can't bribe or blackmail you, right? So they can't say, if you don't do this, we're gonna kick you out of cabinet, right? If someone had ever said that to me, the answer would have been that's fine, right? Like, I'm not going to do what I believe to be wrong just to preserve my position. Don't really care about it that much, right? I'm happy to serve, and I'm grateful for the opportunities to serve, but I'm going to speak the truth. It reminded me when, because I ended up with 3 premiers, I guess, in total that I served. Brian Pallister was the first one for most of the time. He stepped down, so we had an interim one, Calvin Gertzen. Awesome. Best 60 days of my life. I'm kidding. That was actually just as we were still in COVID. So it was a rough ride for him, but he actually did very, very well. And then the newest leader was Heather Stephenson, and super grateful to her because she put me in a role in cabinet, which was not necessarily expected, but certainly very much appreciated that I had that role in cabinet, and that I could get back in Treasury Board and serve there as the vice chair of Treasury Board. I can't remember where I was going with all this. The 3 different leaders, 3 different attitudes, 3 different personalities. But when Premier Stephenson came to my nomination meeting, which is just a formality that we have to go through every election, right? To say, hey, this guy's the MLA. Nobody else wants to be the MLA. So, yay. It's just supposed to be a rah-rah event. But she comes and she speaks, right? And people come because they want to hear her or meet her as the premier and see what she has to say about me. And specifically, And I got a bunch of my supporters, people who are willing to give me $400 every year or more than that, sitting there and wondering what my relationship is with this new premier. And she gets in front of the crowd and she says, James is the kind of MLA who I can count on to say what needs to be said and to tell me things he knows full well I do not want to hear because he knows I need to hear them. I'm like, that was the most interesting endorsement ever. but but it was totally true, right? And everybody in the audience was like, "Well, that's good," that he tells her stuff that she doesn't want to hear because she needs to. But that was kind of a reputation that I built. But I would do that, like with her, I would do that in private mostly. Like why would I try to do that at a cabinet meeting or a caucus meeting where I'm peacocking, right? I'm trying to get good outcomes. It's not trying to get promotions.
Yeah, right.
So.
Yeah, that's interesting. How does it play? Like, I mean, obviously, when you're in politics, you're fairly out there in the public eye. There's always something that, like, if I look up you up on Wikipedia, they always give you a couple of this is what he.
Oh, don't do that.
This is what all the controversy around this guy, right? And there's not much. But as a Christian in there, like, how do you deal with that in the church? Because it's one of those things where, there's always lots of opinions on, well, did you take a good enough stand here or there, or here somewhere you could have spoken up. And they don't, I mean, most people don't see what's going on behind the scenes or even care to speak to you one-on-one to find out. But how do you deal with that?
So, I mean, media is media. And I think, before we got the recording going, I was saying that as a backbench MLA, not a lot of media. I had an opportunity to write in my local. There's a couple of papers that are local to this area. I would write an article every couple of weeks in there, and then I would do the odd local interview. But like in terms of province-wide news or national news or anything like that, there's not a lot of opportunities for backbench MLA, and the government comms kind of tries to keep it that way. They sort of, they want to control the message, right? So they want to minimize exposure and things like that.
That's interesting.
So you don't get a lot there, but with my own people, like at church, I would be pretty frank with them, and I would say, look, you can't tell anybody else this, but I can tell you that this is what I said to the health minister, this is what I said to the finance minister, this is what I said to the premier in a closed door meeting, and that for the most part that would satisfy them, right? And so. I mean, maybe a good example would be we had all the controversy. I mean, there's all kinds of times through COVID where it was difficult, I think, for any politician. It was just a hard time for everyone, and there was expectations from all sides on what politicians should and should not be doing. And I was actually, rather than kind of turtling like I think a lot of politicians did, they just sort of tried to hide in their shell a bit and wait for the weather to pass. I was very much engaged with people, but I wasn't necessarily taking positions that they might have expected me to take. I was more just informing them. This is what the rule is. This is what that means you're allowed to do. If you have a question, ask me the question. I will answer the question. To the degree where my social media was actually outperforming the government's social media about 10 to 1. And I would routinely get 250,000 looks on 250,000 views on things like, here's a summary of the public health orders, right? And if anybody had a question, I would answer it. And so that took a lot of energy and time, but people really did appreciate that I was out there and willing to have those conversations. But then, we had a situation where Springs Church, which is a large evangelical church, they were doing a parking lot service, and the government had decided that wasn't even allowed, right? And this is when they were going through all these essential and non-essential things you could buy at the store. It was just terrible. Really, really tough policies coming down that didn't necessarily make a lot of sense and weren't really that effective in hindsight. But with that one, people ask me, well, aren't you going to stand up and raise the battle cry on behalf of this evangelical church? And my answer was, I'm standing up for them, but I'm doing it in a way that I think is going to be the most effective, which was to privately speak to Brian Pallister, privately remind him that last weekend was Black Friday, and Best Buy, which is not a essential service or not essential in all definitions, had a full parking lot. Best Buy was allowing, one customer at a time to enter their store. So I reminded him of that, and I said, and that's why this rule needs to change. And he agreed. So, and then from there it went on, and it did get changed. But I wasn't going to publicly make a declaration against my own government, because that would have completely removed my ability to have any influence. Quite frankly, it would have likely would have resulted in the opposite effect, that whatever I suggested, they would then suggest something else, which is not what you want.
Right. So that's, I guess that's kind of a difference when you're on the outside of politics looking in, either as a journalist or say you're just a public, like people losing it on Twitter or whatever. Like then like trying to get a loud voice can help, I suppose. Like maybe not always, but I guess when you're on the inside, it's not necessarily how loud can you be voicing the dissent. Like,
No.
Until maybe you see someone like some of the MPs now, the Liberal MPs starting to stand up against Trudeau because they just see the thing crashing and they want to be on the top of the heap after. Like that's not.
Yeah, and honestly, I don't think that's going to work out very well for most of them. It won't work out that well.
No.
So whatever, they'll have to sort all that out. They'll have to sort all that out themselves. But I think, yeah, to take that into the public square, that's not the way politics is supposed to work. You're supposed to function as a team, right? I mean, we would think the same thing, like if you had a church council that's like, oh, we've decided to put a food donation box in our fellowship hall, and then one of the elders is like, I think this is a terrible idea, right? It's like, yeah, well, we decided it, so now you don't get to say that out loud, because
Right.
we're a body, and when we make a decision, then we kind of you can appeal, but it's considered,
but internally,
on the group, yeah. So you can voice your decision internally, and so I think the same principles apply in caucus, and they as they should.
So how was that navigating COVID then? Because it was like I mean, that was obviously the craziest time ever, but especially to be a politician or Christian politician or somebody, even anyone who disagreed with what the government was doing, like I guess you even mentioned the media, like who are the people that make those decisions? Like, I mean, it's like the premier and then his, close staffers and stuff. Who's putting a lid on your media presence and stuff like that? And then why didn't they with COVID?
Well, they tried. Yeah, I mean, it's a bit of a negotiation there, right? As to how you want to behave. So like one of my colleagues, for example, he did kind of speak out, and arguably, he might have gotten kicked out of caucus if things had gone forward in a sane way. And it turns out timing was such that that ended up not happening. But for me, most of the time during COVID, I was frustrated with what government comms was doing, what they were willing to publish. And I told them why I was frustrated. And I was not there's no self-interest there. There's no partisanship even. It's important to get factual information out to the public, to be able to explain and defend your health orders, so that people at least understand them. Even if they don't agree with them, they at least have to know what it means. Like, can I, my grandma phoned me and said that she's really, really sad, and she's super, super lonely, but according to the health orders, I can't visit her. And it's like, actually, according to the health orders, you can visit her, because it says mental health visits are allowed, and this is how to conduct them, right? And so those kind of clarifications and trying to make people understand that the rules weren't quite as heavy-handed as they often came across. Sometimes they weren't that heavy-handed, mind you, but
was the government in those moments trying to pass off, like, was the communication team kind of passing off those not so strict orders in the most heavy-handed way possible so that people would think they were more restrictive?
No, like the media would focus on the heavy,
right?
And I think for starters, you have to understand, and I've explained this to a few folks about, like, if you know Pascal's wager, if you've ever heard of that, quickly explain it for people. I mean, Pascal's wager, the basics are, should you believe in God, and should you not believe in God, and does God exist, or does God not exist, right? And the answer is, well, you you should believe in God, because if he exists, that's great. And if he doesn't exist, it's not particularly important. And similarly, if you don't believe in God and he does exist, it's very, very bad. But if he doesn't exist, it's very, very small benefit to not believing in him. And so that's Pascal's wager. Now, when it comes to COVID, it was over and over applied the same way. It was, should we increase the severity of the health orders, or should we lower the severity of the health orders? And the two outcomes were the spread of COVID goes nuts, or the spread of COVID goes down. And Pascal's wager would tell you should always increase the health orders because,
right.
well, this is Pascal's wager for politicians, right? And for even for the doctors and stuff like that, because they knew that if they lowered the public health orders and COVID went nuts, they would burn for it. Mm-hmm. Like the negative consequences to them for making that mistake would be profound. Whereas if they cranked up the health orders and COVID kind of didn't do anything, or even declined, they could even say, "Oh, look what we did." Right. They'd take credit that whether it was due or not, and they would, or they'd at least say, and if COVID, sorry, if they cranked up the health orders and COVID spiked anyways because the health orders were ineffective, for example, well, they'd still say, "Good thing we cranked them." Because if we had it could be, right? And so politically, like it was this vice that just squeezed. It offered a political squeeze, and even for the doctors and things like that, into caution, abundances of caution, right? So it's really, really tough environment to operate in, especially if you're not grounded or principled. You're just gonna get squashed towards one particular outcome. So yeah, it was challenging, and plus I did like a super boneheaded thing, and I took my family on a very COVID careful vacation, where we were stuck alone in a cottage for a week without seeing anybody else. But this was at the same time as other politicians were doing very inappropriate things and going to resorts in the Bahamas and stuff. So I burned pretty hard for that, and it was like probably the dumbest thing I've ever done. So,
but a good vacation with the family.
The family appreciated it. And it was COVID careful, but it was interesting there too, because I wanted to make a public statement, and my comms team was like, "No, you don't get to." And so I'm like, "Well, then I'll have to make private statements." And they're like, "You can make as many private statements as you want." And so I think I topped out around 2,800 individual conversations with people to apologize for what I did, to explain kind of the precautions that I took while I did it, and to say that I will do my best not to be so boneheaded in the future. So it was a lot, a lot of conversations, and but that's all part of. I think that's part of how to interact with the public. Like that was the reputation I think that I developed, was that I would answer questions, and I would be engaged. I would be engaged in social media. You call my office, you get a response. If you email me, you get a response, and usually a personal one. So yeah.
Right. Yeah, and that was good. Yeah, that's a good way to serve too, right? But yeah, it's interesting. It's always interesting to hear how government forms and how they like make these decisions. I guess like COVID was a tough one from, so many perspectives. Like the Pascal's wager thing makes sense as a politician. It's also not taking in consideration like the like it's like this is only about COVID. It's not taking in consideration all the other impacts of raising health measures and stuff, which is in the immediate. That's what serves politicians a lot of the time, right? So the immediate consequences
I think it was the intended, like this is the problem with all government policy. So we can get away from COVID and just look at just generally all government policy is developed with a purpose of achieving an intended outcome. But almost, most government policy fails because they don't really think about the unintended outcome, right? And that's where the Conservatives federally, I think, are doing a pretty good job, for example, on the safe injection site, saying, look, the intention of the policy is to make sure that addicts don't die. That's why we have safe injection sites, right? Or whatever they want to call them. But that's the intention of the policy. But the unintended consequence of those policies can be measured, right? And the answer is, well, where these sites exist, actually the number of overdose deaths goes up. The amount of drug use goes up. The amount of drug use amongst kids goes up, right? And so is that was that going to happen anyways in those areas, or did actually opening the safe injection site make that even more likely to occur? Yeah, so it's I think when any government policy is evaluated, it's got to be intended consequences and then unintended consequences. You have to look at both to decide what.
Yeah, and I guess, we got to be sympathetic as people to, as citizens, to be like, yeah, all right. I mean, politicians aren't going to get it right every time, but look at what the intentions are, I guess.
Well, yeah.
Oh, so we touched a little bit on people getting into politics, but I wanted to also touch on, like, do you have any advice for Christians, like our Christian churches? Like, have we learned anything over the last years? Have you learned anything being in politics about how to best engage, like, especially local politics? I mean, federal is tough, and I think ARPA does a good job on a lot of that stuff, but like locally, like, how can we get involved, I guess, but also not just involved, but like communicate well with our MLAs who are, maybe not even Christians, or maybe not even a party that we enjoy.
Yeah, I would say like the ARPA model. I'm a school from that school, so I think that's a good model. I would probably tweak it just maybe a little bit from what I think generally people are doing, which is, as much as possible, use the language and the logic, sometimes even, of your audience rather than your own. So a simple example of that would be, like, a lot of churches were saying during COVID, and I hate to go back there again, but churches are essential, right? And government at the time, some governments at least, just disagreed, right? They're like, well, you can think that, but I disagree, and therefore whatever. And so when I went after it, I was like, Best Buy is not essential. And they're like, we agree. I said, and yet, right? And yet, parking lot's full. People are walking in and out of the building, using the bathrooms, right? It's like, hey, so you think we can do that at church? And so then I could actually have a winsome conversation with them by using their language. I never said I agree that church is not essential. I would never agree to that. But I also knew that just stating that at the beginning would just close their ears. They would stop listening to you. So I think if you want to have an influence, that's good. I would also say, like, you're trying to build relationship. And so to the degree that you can understand who they are, or even just ask about their personal circumstances and things like that, and how that's going, and if they're getting enough time with their family, and just simple things like that. That's good, right? So then it's relationships, so you feel more like a friend in a way, or someone who actually is concerned and not just self-interested, and I've got my issue that I want to talk to you about, and that's all I want to do. I'm just more generally concerned for them as people is good. And then when you do have somebody that you are aligned with politically, finding ways to support them. So financially, door knocking, like volunteering on a campaign, banging in signs, or whatever it is that they might need. So yeah, and I mean, I had a lot of support from my church community, all 3 elections. So that was really, really good. But it the longer it went on, probably the harder it got to get the volunteers.
Right.
I think there was an expectation that at some point I should just be able to do this myself.
Like, we got you off the ground.
No, exactly. Yeah. How much more rocket fuel do you need? No, like, so the last election, for example, I hired 3, well, depending on how you count, 4 or 5, but we'll say 3 summer students that were 15 years old. And I just said, look, I'm going door knocking every day for 6 hours. I need a team to be with me, and it's just not reasonable for me to expect to be able to staff a volunteer force at that pace of 36 hours of door knocking a week, or more than that. Most teams, when they go door knocking, it's kind of blitzy, and they're like, hey, this Friday night we're going to come, and please come together. And I could get people together for that. But if I just said, hey, could you show up at 10:30 a.m. or at 1 p.m. or something, and stay here till 8 p.m. and we'll take a half an hour for a pizza break, and go. Right. It was more marathon like. It was just harder. So but it was so they got some summer employment out of the deal, and I got some good helpers, and they learned a lot along the way too. And they're all, I think the 3 that I worked most are all more confident and more capable and able to take on more jobs in the future. And who knows, maybe they'll even run for public office one day. You never know.
Say replace you there. That's great.
That'd be wonderful.
Yeah, I would recommend that actually. If the people I've seen who do that stuff, the door knocking, calling for political parties and stuff like that, it's not a, I guess it's not a really easy thing to do when you're knocking on someone's door. You don't know who they are.
Not
It's
at first. It
not
gets
ever
easier.
right. It's not
Yeah.
everyone's favorite thing, but it definitely, I mean, it builds character, but also builds some really good skills in sales. And yeah, I would recommend it from, yeah.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
yeah, that's interesting. So what about if once you're in office, like, do you as an MLA have good relationships, like personally with, I mean, obviously with your church community, but um, as, let's say aside from that, like if it was an MLA who's not part of our community, is it better to engage individually, like to call and to email and to get to know that person personally, or as an organization? Like does ARPA have a little bit more sway? Does like or a local chapter of ARPA, or even as a church or a school community to say, hey, this is one thing we care about and we want to lobby as a community?
Yeah. I'd say both have a role. Um, like the individual one lets you get more personal, and uh, so that part is good. But if you're relentless, you probably develop a reputation of being, oh,
Right.
here they come again. Right. I've lost count of how many times I've met with this particular, person who has a lot to say about one particular topic or two
Right.
particular topics. So it has to be proportionate there. But political offices are also going to look and say, well, this what this is this represents about 3,000 votes in my riding, and so I need to
Right.
listen ARPA Canada because like I want those 3,000 votes, or certainly I don't want all of them against me.
Right.
And so yeah, there's that political calculus is going to be part of any politician's office when they're evaluating like which event should I go to, or should I, how much energy should I invest, because you're finite as a politician. There is a limit to how many events you can go to, how many responses you can send, how personal those responses can be.
Hmm.
So when we would get 12 emails on a particular topic, I'd probably draft a general letter and I'd add a paragraph of personal content around it, or I have my assistant draft a letter and I would put a little paragraph of content around it to make it more personal. So that's if I got 10 or 12, but I got 500. Sorry, I think everybody's getting the same response.
You're
I just
right.
I can't
You're all getting
I
the
can't
company Christmas card. That's it.
Yeah, and if it's only one, then I'll be like, well, why don't you come in and we'll talk,
Right.
right? And do a half an hour meeting. Certainly, if it's about something unique, right? Even if it's something that I disagree with, I'll still like have the conversation for
Right.
sure. So
Yeah, that's fair enough. That's yeah, I've seen like writings where you kind of have both things. Like you have a supportive or like our writing here in Calgary. We have Chantel DeYoung, who's part of the URC church, I believe. And she's I mean, she's huge for our community, like just to get to know her and to like she comes to our community events, like
yeah,
um she came to our gym opening and stuff like that. And she's really like an amazing yeah, I don't know. You can't say weapon in your arsenal, but something like it's like it's an insider into the government, right?
yeah,
From basically from your
yeah,
community. And that's been extremely beneficial, extremely helpful. But also I've seen where you almost can't get engagement from your political representatives, which is a shame, but it's also something that I guess we have to look to improve or displace them. That's fine too. That's
that's okay. Yeah, that's another way. But yeah, like if they blacklist you, that's I'd say, well, what kind of led to that? But some are just like there are some politicians on all sides of the house that are not particularly excited about doing their work, or they're not really engaged in doing it particularly well. I had one guy brag to me that he's he had been away for, I think it was 14 weeks over the summer, and that he had taken 6 constituency calls, but 5 of them were while he was golfing, and so that was great. And the rest of the time he was essentially on vacation, right? And I'm going like, I don't know what you're doing. Like, why are you proud of that? That
that's
doesn't make any
not
sense to
yeah.
me.
That's it. Yeah. Although I'm sure lots of people treat it like that too. That's I'm in, the work is done.
Yeah, one of the previous opposition ministers from some time ago said, "Oh, the being a cabinet minister was the best part-time job I ever had," right? And it's like, what? When I became a cabinet minister, my week went like I hit 70 hours every week. It was just
Wow.
over the top.
What were you minister of again?
So essentially, it was like a mini finance minister because we used to have the finance portfolio just got bigger and bigger and bigger, and then they split off. They called it so we had. I'm the Minister of Consumer Protection and Government Services, the minister responsible for the Manitoba Civil Service, so that's HR,
Right.
and the minister responsible for the Public Utilities Board, and then Government Services is just this huge umbrella that means like you're the real estate guy. So like every building the government has, every piece of land that they have that's not agricultural, you got to make sure it's taken care of and that the
Wow.
buildings are getting repaired and everything else. And then I had to do all the IT. So I was IT, HR, land and buildings, legislative grounds, security. Um, yeah, just bunch of stuff. Vital statistics. For whatever
That's
reason, as a
huge. What,
residential tenancies branch, I had
how is
about
that one job?
there's like 8,000 civil servants or something underneath me as
They might
the
need to
basically.
branch out again. That sounds crazy.
It's okay. But yeah, it's I mean, just like any other, I mean, you think Google or Hewlett Packard or whatever, all these companies, they have one CEO, right? And then that CEO has, maybe 8 senior vice presidents or something like that. I mean, well, how many people report up to each one of those?
Yeah.
It's quite a lot, right? And so um yeah, and that was interesting too when I was in the minister's role. Um, then you have a better sense of like how other ministers have been behaving on either side of the house over the history of governments in Manitoba and other provinces, and you know how much opportunity you have to make it your own, right? So right away
Right.
when I got in the role, I was very willing to engage with media, whereas my predecessor not so much, right? Preferred not to.
Right.
Was willing to do media if it was for sure a government thing, but if there's any hint of controversy, would kind of shy away from it. So because I was the minister for legislative grounds, for example, that also means I'm the minister for somebody knocked over Queen Victoria and smashed her head in. So
Sure.
figure that out. What are you doing with the statue? When's the statue coming back up, etc.? Like those kind of questions would come my way, or someone had put hundreds and hundreds of flags, orange flags, on the front lawn to protest and bring attention to residential schools. And
Right.
is that going to be there forever, or what are we going to do, right? And so those kind of things were media wanted to talk about because it was visible, it was in there, right? But my predecessor would generally not engage, and I generally would. And so that I think my staff appreciated that, my deputy minister and assistant deputies, and so yeah, I was more ready to engage. And then even just getting ready for question period, right? There's the safe response, which is to just say the words that are previously written
Yeah.
down to you for you.
The
Keep your head
question
down.
that you ask back to them when they ask you a question. That's good.
You answer the question they ought to have asked. I think that's
Yeah.
the
Yeah. Oh, there you go. That's the one. Yeah.
well, well, while you're asking about this, I'm going to tell you about that.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, it's what was one of our speakers famously said, well, they don't call it answer period.
Yeah.
Uh, but when I was in the house, I genuinely did try to actually answer. Like if there was a fair question, I'd answer the fair question. If it was an unfair question, I would usually expose the motive, and then get back to government message, which is this is what we're doing and this is why.
Yeah.
But so I had fun in question period, I would say. But the last day, I didn't know it was the last day, of course, when it happened. But last day of me being a minister in the legislature. But for whatever reason, the opposition had decided that they wanted to talk about one particular issue. It was something they were going to carry into the election and use. And so they wanted some soundbite out of me that they could, use for some kind of, hey, this is this uncaring, unsympathetic, Tory in the legislature. And so whether that was me or my premier or some other minister. But so they were asking the same question over and over and over and over and over and over and over. So I can't remember how many. I think I ended up with 19 times I had to respond to the question.
Oh, wow.
In
I
a
think that's
row.
why people don't want to get involved. That sounds brutal.
It did not bother me at all. Did not faze me one bit. So it was fine. And to be fair to my colleagues, they're all like, "Hey, should somebody else take the next question?" And the coordinator's like, "No, he's doing fine. He's fine. You need a break, James? No, I'm good. Okay, answer the next one."
Did you just answer it the same way every time?
No, every answer was different.
Wow,
So
that's impressive.
a lot of key messages, but both who's asking the question would give you material to reference back to, and then what they exactly ask and how they, because they were of course not reading exactly the same question, even though they were getting to the same issue. So yeah, you build that up, I guess, over time, right? Is to have a good understanding of who you're talking to and what they're saying. And I mean, they were pretty merciless with me too. Like I remember going back, I think it was even before I was elected. No, I was a backbencher. The NDP came out and they were like, "We think we should supply a universal breakfast program because no kids should go to school hungry," right? And so my response, which was terrible at the time, like poorly assembled. It was good, maybe logically good, but I said it's important that kids get fed, but they should be fed at home if they can be, right? That's the best place. That's the best place for them to eat. And this offended people quite a lot, but some were feeling that perhaps guilty that they weren't able to have the time to have breakfast with their family at home. And I always did. And I kind of let that be known that I always have breakfast with my family pretty much every day. And I guess that puts me in a position of privilege. But they essentially just took what I had said about breakfast at home is better to meaning I think kids should go to school hungry. Which is clearly never expressed at all, and
right.
nor would I ever agree with that at all. I would rather they got fed at home, but if they still show up hungry, then maybe we should deal with the real problem potentially, which is why is that happening, and we should also make sure that the kids are fed, obviously. But yeah, that would come up all the time. They're like, "Oh, you want to starve children?" They echo you across the.
How long did that last?
It still happens today.
No way.
Yeah, like I'm not even in the legislature and they're still bringing it up. So
yeah. Oh man.
Whatever. They get their trope and they go with it. That's fine.
Yeah, you need something, right? So
I
you got to feed them a little bit. Oh man. Well, it gives a listener a good window into what it's like. I mean, it's maybe not glamorous at times, but I mean, having an influence and being able to be there is quite a good thing, I guess, as also as a Christian to have a voice and to be able to whisper in the ears of those in power. So that's quite something. Yeah, I wanted to ask you about RP actually, because this is brought to you by RP. It's you were in RP, I guess, on the board pretty early on. Was it right at the beginning?
I think I was in my 20s. No, not the beginning. So the beginning of Reform Perspective is the 1970s.
Right.
I think my dad.
I got it right here beside me. It's 81, so 1981.
Oh, 81,
I guess
okay.
that's when it was officially founded, I guess. So
officially founded, yeah. And so like at that time I was 10 years old. So I was not on the board.
Get involved.
But I think my dad was kind of kicking around there, and the editor John DeVos lived in Winnipeg, so it was very much I knew what was going on even when I was a wee lad. But I think I was in my early to mid 20s, and they were looking for board members, and they had asked me already to volunteer to help kind of spur on additional subscriptions and through like a congregational correspondent model.
Right.
And so I'd been doing that, and then they said, "Well, would you like to join the board?" And I said, "Sure, I would join the board." And so I did, and I served as secretary treasurer, I think, for a bunch of years. And yeah.
Wow.
That was kind of, I would say that was relatively maintenance mode for Reform Perspective. Like we kind of just kept the same operational model, and we flirted with ways to expand and We had John, I was on the board when we hired John Dykstra to be the editor,
Oh yeah, that is a long
etc.
time ago. Wow, that's
A long time ago. Yeah. And
yeah, John will appreciate that. That's
yeah, there's a little,
that's
yeah, decades and decades ago. No, I don't know how long ago it quite was, but yeah, I was on the board and I chatted quite a lot with him about what it could be. And what's really neat, I think, about what I've seen since the new model and Mark Peniga joining the organization and all that, enhance like different media outlets, different bigger magazine, um, broader distribution, like all those things. They were all ideas we'd kind of been kicking around the room, me and John Dykstra way back when, but never really managed to find a way to get it done. So it's really good to see it happening.
yeah, it's really cool. It's really cool to be a part of now. It's yeah, I appreciate the work that went into it back then. So it's now it's really humming. Um, yeah, and then that birthed ARPA, I guess, right? Like that's what came out, and that's been huge. I
Yeah,
mean, Mark was over there too originally.
it was. Yeah. Yeah. And I think so for a while there, Reform Perspective actually changed their name to Reform Perspective Foundation. And then they kind of had Reform Perspective Magazine and what became ARPA Canada sort of underneath that. But yeah, I think Mark rightly and quickly recognized that because Reform Perspective is charitable, right? So they're limited in how much political activism they can do by the government, which is, I think, appropriate if you're going to have charitable status. And so he wanted ARPA to become something much bigger than would fit underneath a charity. And so he
Yeah.
asked for it to be separated out. And then at that time, yeah, the board members were asked, like, would you like to join the new board? You didn't have to. And so a bunch of us did, but a few did not come across. And I served on both boards for quite a few years as well. And then trying to think how long I was on the ARPA board. I got this, oh, let me see. I got a certificate somewhere. Well, whatever. It was a long time. Probably longer than most board members are allowed to serve now.
Yeah, right.
Now they have term limits, so I'm pretty sure I got over that mark. But yeah, it was a while.
Yeah, that's just yeah. Well, it's cool to see guys like you doing that instrumental work to get things off the ground, set things up for, just like the guys like us who just kind of do stuff a little bit here and there.
At the time, I had no idea. At the time, I had no idea that it was instrumental or anything like that. I think it's pretty cool for somebody who's in their 20s to get asked to join a board of directors. And then because everybody else on the board was in their 50s and 60s. And so I think one person will be offended I said that. But anyways, that's okay. But it was pretty neat because then I got a chance to kind of get mentored and sort of learn how these kind of things happen, right? And so I like to do the same thing now. I'm the chair of a board called Sail Place. So we do we provide housing to single mothers that are in a crisis, often at risk of losing their children to Child and Family Services.
Mm-hmm.
And we provide them with housing. We provide them with counseling. We get them plugged into a church community, connect them with friends or Selah sisters, as we call them. Yep. And so I'm on that board, and on that board, there's a bunch of different folks, but some of them are younger. And I just tell them, like, this is you stay on, like keep riding, because this will be really cool. Like, you'll look back at it 20 years from now and you'll be, oh, I remember, and I learned so much. Right.
You got to teach people what the internet is and be like, this is what we can do. You don't have to hand deliver the magazines and So what's next for you? Like you're out of politics. Are you looking to get back in? I think I've asked you this once you're visiting our church, but what's you're obviously involved in business and stuff like that. What is your career path?
Yeah, so the company we started was called Conquest Planning. So it's again financial planning software company. Pretty much competes directly against our old company that we sold, and we're killing it. Like, it's going really, really well. We're dominant in the Canadian market, and we're expanding to the UK and the US, and
wow,
got about 155 staff now. So I'm going to stay there and keep doing that. I get to do some cool stuff. I get to do the AI piece of the advice engine, as we call it, and a bunch of simulation stuff, which that turns my crank. I like doing that kind of thing.
Really cool.
Yeah, it's fun. And so I'm mostly coding, which is kind of cool too, because I don't have to do too much of the management because they sort of started up the management structure while I was in politics. And so
Right.
I don't need to insert myself there. So that's really good. And then that'll continue for however long God wills it. And then if all goes well, we'll sell that company as again. And then I'll be at another inflection point in my life of, okay, now what? Um, and so if that lines up
Right at
well
that
with
politics cycle, eh?
that
That's
lines up well with a reentrance, then I'm open to it. But I'm not fussy. Like I think I've also learned enough, and this is something I want your folks to understand is getting involved in government isn't isn't restricted only to being elected. Um, the most influential people that I met in government were not elected. They were staff, they were deputy ministers, assistant deputy ministers, they worked at the treasury board, secretariat. Those people had a bigger impact on what government decided to do and how they decided to do it and when than politicians do.
wow.
And so I don't think I think there's not that much interest, I would say, generally in working your way up the bureaucracy, but there ought to be, because I think there's tremendous opportunity to serve well, to be a faithful administrator, Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego style.
Mm.
But also then to if you do serve well, you can be promoted and have more influence. And yeah, it's a good career path, and not one that I really considered before politics.
Right.
And so even now, like as I'm talking about, well, should I want to run for reelection? I'd also be happy to serve as a staffer in a government, right? And my federal counterpart, Daniel Blakey, he's the NDP MP for this area, or he was. He did that. But basically, he just wasn't finding enough time for his family. He had a young family like me, and being an MP in Ottawa is just brutal. And so he stepped down from that, and he took on a job at the Manitoba Legislature working as a staffer in the Wabkanu government. And now his work-life balance is way better. His
Right.
ability to spend time with his I think 8-year-old kid, just like I have. We both got in politics at the same time. We both had kids roughly the same time, our youngest. And so yeah, that's another avenue. Working in the legislature. It's a good thing
Yeah,
to do.
that's interesting. Something you don't always consider. But is there opportunity to like advisory roles for people in business like yourself? Like, is there opportunities when you have a big business to step in to help the government understand certain policies? I mean, I know you see like the big wigs like Kevin O'Leary and stuff. They're doing that, like, but they're doing that to the media. But like, are there
Yeah,
roles like that touch more closely to
yeah.
the
So
legislature?
there's a whole set of agency boards and commissions where like that. So that might include, for example, the Public Utilities Board. I said I was in charge of the Public Utilities Board,
Hmm.
but that's sort of an arm's length board. It's got an independent nature to it, and same thing with the rental tenancies branch, things like that. There's appointments by government to those kind of roles. And so they're looking for people who would say represent the interests of landlords, represent the interests of tenants, or
Right.
represent the interests of hydro ratepayers. And so there's opportunities, I think, to serve in those kind of roles. And that's typically part-time. It's like a meeting every month or 2 months or something.
Right.
And then depending on the premier, they may assemble like an advisory body um, to give recommendations on what should we do about crime in our city, and they pull together law enforcement, downtown business owners, and they create this advisory
Hmm.
panel to talk about and people who are understanding some of the root causes of the rise in crime in our city, right, and the addictions that go along with it, and those who are serving those with addictions, and all of those people come together to try to make a plan that'll actually work, because it's really hard, probably impossible, to get anything done in government alone.
Right.
Um,
Yeah.
so, and even if you have like the entire provincial government all aligned, if your federal government and your municipal governments are misaligned, pretty hard to be effective. Better if you can actually get some good cooperation and communication
Yeah.
through the
Right.
levels.
Yeah, we see that in Alberta, specifically with Trudeau going to Edmonton to offer them all sorts of money for housing and stuff like that. It's like they're trying to, like, you could
Otherwise
feel that
known
they're
as
trying
please
to,
vote Liberal. Yeah.
yeah, they're trying to create that rift, right? That
Yeah.
and trying to, yeah, disalign everything. But I usually
Mhm.
do this with, I guess we should wrap this up, but I
Sure.
usually do this with our American listeners because I'm always curious about American politics. But how do you see Trudeau's future looking, and what do you think is going to happen with our politics here in Canada federally?
Oh, yeah. So I think I'm probably in the majority of thinking that the Liberals are likely actually going to implode. I don't think they'll vanish. Um, I think, you've seen some like BC and New Brunswick, I think, had some local elections that would suggest that the conservative wave's not quite a tsunami.
Mm,
And so, but there will be plenty of turnover in Parliament. So that kind of flushes gets you some new talent in and sort of kickstarts things differently. I suspect it'll be a conservative-led government. I think it'll be a majority. And then so for Trudeau himself, like he can do whatever he wants, quite
who
frankly.
knows?
maybe
You're not
maybe he'll
going to
go to the
hire him?
Aga Khan, maybe he'll go to the Aga Khan's island again and spend some time there without violating any ethics rules anymore.
Yeah, it's
So,
yeah, we can hope. I guess that might leave some doors open for some people to jump into some flip ridings. That'd be kind of cool. Um,
yeah, I think there's lots of opportunity. Even my riding here, like we just had a by-election because I think Daniel Blakey went over to the legislature, and so it was a close race. NDP ended up holding it, um, but it was a by-election, right? And so
mm,
in a federal election, people often aren't just looking at the two candidates locally; they're looking up, and they're trying to pick their prime minister. So who knows? This riding, which again has been largely NDP, except for that one term with Lawrence Tote as the MP, it could flip again as well. And I think there's certainly any ridings that are held by liberals, like in Ontario, there's lots of opportunity
mhm.
to get in and be a conservative candidate. And in most urban centers, I would say, like in Winnipeg too, there's quite a few seats that arguably are in play, and so good to get good candidates going there.
Yeah, for sure. Sounds like you need to sell your business real quick.
No, I should clarify. So two things there. One is yeah, timing's not right, but the other thing is my youngest kid's 8,
Mm,
right? And he's only ever known me as a politician. He was born 2 months after I got elected. And then I got a 13-year-old and a 15-year-old. For them, they're adult. Their most poignant memories are me being an MLA. That's
right.
just what they remember and how they've experienced it. So for me to either have to yank them and take them all the way to Ottawa to live with me there, or to essentially abandon them and let them live here while I go off to Ottawa,
It's pretty
neither of
tough.
those was they're not acceptable to me. So I
Yeah.
don't, yeah,
Yeah.
I don't have the narcissism that can sometimes fuel politicians.
That's what you need to cultivate. I see. Okay.
No, that was a terrible thing to say. That was a
That's good.
terrible thing to say. But I think like I think if you're in it, like I remember talking to an NDP cabinet minister, and he had gotten defeated by us in 2016, and he was surprised that it happened. It was super tight, and he only lost by a couple hundred votes. But I was wondering, how he was doing. I talked to him about 7 years after he had lost, and I ran into him at a charity event, and he's like, "Oh, I'm so grateful. Like if I hadn't lost, I don't think I would have ever gotten out." And my heart was like almost turning black from all the garbage that you had to deal with in the legislature and all the nastiness and the tough stuff. And so he was just grateful for the opportunity to have a rest, which was not the outcome I expected at all. But he had served for a good number of years, and he had arguably served pretty well
Mm,
in what he did. So yeah, I think he had a good attitude there. So I try to have the same attitude.
yeah. Well, blessings on your work. That's it sounds like you had quite an impact there, and yeah, thankful I guess for the opportunity to chat today and give our listeners a little bit of a glimpse into provincial politics. We've done this before a couple times about provincial politics and just getting involved in general, but it's cool to see the insides of what the goings on, I guess. So yeah, is there anything else that you would want to add? Otherwise, we'll let you go.
Yeah, no, I think getting back to what you kind of started with, it is important to encourage people to consider public service. And I'm using that broad term to include both the elected kind of public service, but also the working in a bureaucracy and finding ways to serve there. I think both of those are places where you can have an impact and where you can serve God's kingdom too, right? And even if the government is largely unchristian, or you get that sense too when you're on the outside, if you work faithfully and diligently, typically you'll get rewarded, and like I said, you'll have an opportunity to shine a different kind of light than maybe they're used to encountering. So it's good to get involved, and it's good to support those who are willing to get involved. So yeah, I just want to encourage everybody to keep that in mind. And if there's anybody in Manitoba who's thinking about running that I don't know about, just let me know, and we'll talk.
There you go. You got a contact now. Hey, James Teitsma, appreciate it. Thanks for sharing your journey through this. Appreciate it.
See ya.
Thanks everyone for listening. We'll catch you next time. Thanks for tuning in to this episode of Real Talk. In partnership with Reform Perspective, this show is created and produced by Tyler Vanderwood, Lucas Holtvloer, and Mariah Tamiga. We really appreciate you taking the time to listen or watch the show. If you have any feedback for us or ideas for future guests or topics, please let us know. You can reach us at reformedrealtalk@gmail.com. Be sure to also follow us on social media. You can search Reformed Real Talk on any of the platforms. We should come right up. Also, leave us a review, preferably a 5-star run, on any of the podcast platforms. That would be greatly appreciated. That's all for now, folks. Keep having real talk.